our YouTube broadcast. And we're live. Okay, so welcome everybody to another episode of Tech Talks. Today we are going to talk about grading rubrics. And we are going to kind of split our time between first talking about, how do you design an effective, useful rubric in the first place. It's kind of some best practices, some guidelines, a framework for that. And then we'll talk about the technical side of once you have it designed, how do you get it into Canvas? How do you use it? How do you organize it? Because Canvas has some little quirks and weird things about rubrics. And we have sort of a workflow that will avoid most of those issues and hopefully make rubrics more convenient to use in Canvas, I guess. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen because I have just a little, I wouldn't even hardly call it a slideshow. It's more of just a sort of a template and a framework for building rubrics. And this is based off of a really nice article written in 2007, The Role of Rubrics in Advancing and Assessing Student Learning. Is that you, Nick?
That would be Ben.
Oh, so Ben's with us, but he's going to turn off his sound. There we go. Got it. Okay. Ben's right around the table, and you can kind of see his monitor sticking out the corner there. There's his hand. Okay. I'm gonna put this link in the chat.
Yeah, good call,
maybe. There we go. So this is just a pretty nice journal article that kind of gives a framework and some guidelines for designing rubrics, and then it also has some research about the effectiveness of rubrics. So it's a nice resource to have in your back pocket. It's one that I've used in the past. So I'm kind of basing this piece of the Tech Talk on that document. But in their framework to design a good rubric, the first thing you do is you design your what they call performance criteria. And it basically, you start with either the performance task or the learning objective for the activity that the rubric is being designed for. And you identify the criteria that defines success for that thing. How do we know that students understand a skill or a process? How do we know that they've successfully completed a project or written a paper in following the specifications that we want them to follow? So that's the first thing you do is, what are the criteria that define success for that thing that's being graded or being assessed with your rubric? They said that usually between 3 and 6 criteria are best. And that's just kind of more of a rule of thumb than anything. But I think it makes sense that too many criteria can kind of be overwhelming for the students. There's so many things to list out to follow that it becomes easy to forget things or miss things. It also becomes less useful for the instructor, because if you are grading based on 10 or 15 different criteria, you're not really saving yourself any time compared to just writing out a big long list of feedback. Part of one of the reasons we use rubrics is it is a way to give more detailed feedback without taking a huge amount of time writing those things out. So it's finding that balance. Criteria also should be observable and measurable. And this is kind of goes back to like best practice for learning objectives too, right? You can't just say, well, your learning objective is students will understand something. How do you measure that? It has to be something that you can observe and you can measure. So action verbs are good. Students will be able to list X, Y, and Z or do something. So that's kind of an important part of designing these criteria.
Gotcha.
Another thing that they talk about in this article, which I think is kind of cool, is you could potentially work with your students to co-create those criteria. So if you have a big project in a class, it might be nice to start with a conversation with your students and help them determine what are the criteria of success for this project? What do you want to get out of this? What do you want to demonstrate? Help them come up with that and then use that to build the rubric. That's probably not always necessary or appropriate, but in some contexts and for some projects, I really like that idea of having the students help you build that criteria. because hopefully that gives them more buy-in in the process, helps them understand what's happening. It's about transparency, right? It's kind of like Tilt. It's about opening up and shining a light on this whole process of how we came up with these criteria in the first place.
Nothing more transparent than being the one who made it, right?
Right, exactly. So once you have your performance criteria, then you come up with your performance levels. And again, they say usually between 3 and 6 levels are probably best. Part of this comes down to what's called intra-rater reliability, which basically means, this was something that Jared told me about, basically means the ability of a rater or a grader or an instructor to reliably score something over and over again without a huge range of scores or ratings for something that has meeting the same criteria. And the example that he told me about was this idea of, if you had 100 buckets in a row, 100 of them, that's your 100-point scale, and you ask somebody to take an object and put it in one of those buckets, and then the next day you ask them to go and do it again, they're probably not going to pick the same bucket. When you're doing grading out of 100, it's really hard to be reliable. And then all kinds of things come into it. Your personal biases, conscious or unconscious, what you ate for lunch, whether you got enough sleep yesterday, whether the student before them had something really good or really bad. If you found an example of cheating from a previous student and now your whole mood is ruined, all those things affect your ability to reliably rate something. So the fewer performance levels you have, the easier it is to be reliable and reproducible. And that's just one way of reducing potential bias. Another kind of rule of thumb that they gave that I think is helpful. Formative activities probably benefit from more performance levels, because that's a way to provide more granularity and more specific feedback about developmental skills and that sort of thing. Whereas a more summative activity, if it's your very last presentation of the class and this is the capstone of everything you've been working towards, you probably need fewer performance levels. You might only need pass or fail, complete or incomplete, because at that point, hopefully, students have gotten enough feedback and formative assessment over time that they know what's expected of them. It also makes your life easier. Again, finals week, if you only have 2 or 3 performance levels, it's much easier for you to get through things and do it quickly, concisely, and again, hopefully with less bias. Just looking at the chat here. Sometimes the IRR, inter-rater reliability, can take a few times to rewrite your rubric. Jennifer, you want to talk about that a little bit? What are you thinking?
Mostly what I was thinking is sometimes it takes me a couple of quarters to feel like I really dialed in on the criteria and the ratings for a particular assignment because of all those other, extraneous things that I can't necessarily control. So sometimes it definitely takes a couple of iterations on a rubric to feel like, oh, okay, I can overlook these small nuances within a student and still grade them with XYZ. Yeah.
That totally makes sense. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I've noticed the same thing when I've used rubrics in my classes, is it does take a little while to dial it in. Another thing that they talk about is what language would you use for your performance levels? In this case, the example that I'm using here is from a graduate level class that I adjunct teach. So at that level, it's not very developmental. These are all professionals who are already in the field and they're just getting their master's degree. So I go with kind of your traditional good, excellent, poor, and acceptable. At other levels, it might make more sense to use developmental language like emerging, developing, arrived, below proficient, above proficient, proficient, or maybe just complete, incomplete. It kind of depends on the developmental level that you're teaching, whether it's a first quarter class or a second year class. It might matter, it might depend. So it's just a matter of being reflective about what language makes sense in that context, I think. After you've got your criteria and your performance levels, then you go into your table and you start filling out each cell with performance descriptions. So providing enough information to guide the creation and the scoring of the project, but you don't want so much detail that, again, it becomes overwhelming for the student to try to pay attention to every single thing in here. It needs to be descriptive, but as concise as you can make it. Another thing that is important is those descriptions should be parallel across each criteria. So like in this example, this is a discussion rubric that I use in my class. And the description here, displays an excellent understanding of required readings and concepts, integrates outside research or real world applications to support discussion. That's obviously the top tier. What I'm really looking for in that content section is not only did you read it, but did you also bring in other knowledge to support what you're reading about. But then the parallel structure is, well, to be good, like a B grade or something, you need to still at least display an understanding of the reading. And then not so good is you're really just summarizing and repeating what you've read without a lot of evidence of understanding or reflection. And then unacceptable is either didn't demonstrate it at all or just didn't make a discussion post. Because in this case, if a student just doesn't post, I also still want to use this grading rubric and just tell them, well, you just didn't do it. So it's important to kind of have that consistent language across a criteria so that it's kind of each level is +1 from the previous level. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Jennifer in the chat says, be careful on your excellent criteria of having 2 different things that you're assessing.
Yeah. So in that case, it might make sense to have 2 different criteria rather than 1. Again, context matters in a graduate level program, and also not the first class in the program. There's already kind of some expectations built into the cohort, so it's not quite as critical. But at a more foundational class, it might make more sense to split those up and be more explicit.
Gotcha.
And then lastly, and this one is kind of optional, is your scores or your values for your performance level. Because if you're using this as a scored rubric, then you need to decide how each of those performance cells translate into a grade or a score. You can also decide if you want to weight one criteria higher than another. So maybe content is more important than writing mechanics, unless it's an English class, in which case writing mechanics might be really important. But if that's not the most important, then you might weight that lower than some of the other criteria. And this is another part, like Jennifer said, where it might take a little bit of iteration and dialing in to figure out the right balance of scores. What I like to do is, after I've kind of designed the basic rubric and given what I think are appropriate scores for each level, is I'll sort of play with it and say, well, what if a student got excellent in this, good in this, and good at this? What does that turn into? Does it turn into a B? And is a B the appropriate grade for that kind of work? Is that too high? Is that too low? If somebody turns in something that's really poor and clearly they didn't put in the effort, what score is the rubric going to give them? And am I satisfied with that score? Or in this case, do I have a 0 level performance level for somebody that just straight up didn't turn anything in, or wrote a single sentence just so that it was off their to-do list, but they clearly weren't paying attention or doing the effort? How do I score that? So those are the kind of questions you would ask when you are putting scores on your rubric design. But
I think that's a good point.
Mhm.
And I'll make fun of my fellow English teachers, because I was working with a faculty member at a different institution, and they had a rubric for their essay, but every time if a student's mechanics were just awful, they would pretty much just give them a 0 and make them redo it and not give them any points for their content. I said,
Right.
well, let's look at the rubric and
Yeah.
maybe evaluate the points and
Right.
prioritize what you think is important here.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to be like, well, this is just not good enough at all, but not give them any points for what's actually
Right,
written.
in which case you're not really using the rubric like you should be probably
Yeah.
using it. But the other point to make here is you don't necessarily have to have points associated with a rubric. This is something that we've talked about when we've done discussions on ungrading. A rubric can still be a useful feedback mechanism and also a useful tilt mechanism for showing what the criteria for success or the specifications or the requirement of the assignment is, even if there are no points attached to it. The assignment itself might simply be complete or incomplete, met or not met. You did it or you didn't, but you still want to use a rubric to give more detailed feedback of this is what you did a fantastic job on. This could use a little more work. This, you are maybe missing some foundational skills that we need to address. So the rubric can be useful even if there's no score attached to it. So that's it for the design part. That's kind of the framework that these authors, where did I put that? Stevens and Wolf give. I like that framework a lot. So I would, if you're interested in this topic, I would recommend you take a look at that article. It might be helpful to you. And then Nick, we were going to talk about the Canvas side of things. Once you have the rubric designed, what do you do with it?
Yeah, and I think, it would be nice to say, oh yeah, you just throw it in Canvas and it's a done deal. But I think we all know kind of where this is going. So with rubrics, we've kind of been thinking through workflows, and we strongly advise that if you are choosing to do rubrics, which we are always a fan of, to build them, design them outside of Canvas, and then bring them in when you're ready. So have a place, whether that be in Google Docs, a OneDrive folder, maybe not a flash drive, so if you lose it, everything's gone forever, but you get the idea. A place where you'll be able to find it so that you can copy it over, because Canvas has some weird quirks when it comes to rubrics. There's a lot of ways to build them, but if you build it the wrong way, you could end up deleting all of them from your course and having to restart or just use your imagination. So we're in just a demo course that I've got built. I've got some modules and assignments in here. When we're going to be building rubrics, assuming we've done the design, we're happy with it so far, we're going to pop over into our course navigation. We're going to find our rubrics folder, as I like to call it, over here on the left-hand side. When we click in, we'll see a list, an alphabetical list of whatever rubrics we might have that's associated with just this course. Any course you're a teacher in, so an instructor in, you can pull those rubrics from it, but you run the risk of potentially not copying it over right, creating duplicates, versioning issues start to crop up. So every time you're putting rubrics into a course, start fresh, add it directly into this folder, and that should fix a lot of the issues that are associated with rubrics. And you do that simply by clicking this Add Rubric button. Well, let's keep the title Some Rubric. Numerals will be counted first in this alphabetical list. So if you do like to try to keep certain things in certain orders, that's an easy way to do that. So I'll just do 1, or maybe number 1, Some Rubric. Let's give it a point value of 30. And here we've got our criteria that we can add using this plus icon down at the bottom. We can duplicate criteria that are already made. So if you have wording that you are using consistently, you can duplicate that, or you can just start from scratch, which will allow you to then give the description. So remember kind of Caleb's Google slide, those were the bold letters on the left-hand side. And then a long description is a little bit more context if it isn't super clear, which you never really want a rubric that doesn't have super clear titles. But if you do need that extra bit of context, you can have it right here, and a student would be able to click in and expand and go, oh, that's what content means. Oh, that's right. We talked about that in class, or, refer to it. So we'll just do example. I'm going to be very plain here. You can edit or delete using the icons in the top right for the criteria. And then they call it ratings, but you can add different ratings. You can have a different number of ratings for each criteria. So you could create a pretty complex rubric if you're looking to do so. And you have the ability to change the actual point values associated with each. So in this case, this would be 0 or 30 up at the top because of that point value over on the right. There we go. And then in here, you can kind of stratify it out. But this is where you would give whatever titling. And then once again, a rating description. So that's an expandable description that's associated with it. Not always necessary if everything's pretty clear. I should get let's do. There we go.
Which is perhaps not the most appropriate performance level type description for designing a rubric.
Do as I say, not as I do.
Yeah. Maybe that's for PhD students.
There you go.
They really like
so
that.
You got it, or you're mediocre. So once you're feeling pretty comfortable with your rubric, you've copied information over. I'm assuming most of the design's happening outside of the space. Create the rubric. It will first show up in a box, so you can kind of see what you did last. But if I refresh the page, the title will not be there, and I can click into it to jump in. Once I'm ready to add this to an assignment, that's where I go and find the actual assignment. And let's say I want to do this figure annotation assignment. So it's already got a rubric, but I can just quickly remove it. Sure, I want to delete this. I'm deleting it from the assignment in this case, not from actual course. If I built that rubric in another course and copied it over, or built it directly in the assignment, when I would have just deleted, I would have deleted it from the course as a whole, which is a really weird quirk. So that's once again
one of those heartbreaking potential rubric problems with the way Canvas handles it. So that's why we recommend building them out in the rubrics section first and then attaching them.
Yeah, exactly. And so we've already got it built, so I don't actually need to create another rubric, but by clicking in the add a rubric, it's going to pop you into a creator first. I'm actually going to come over to find a rubric, and then I'll get a list of all the courses that I have rubrics for that I am an instructor in, and I can search through there. So in this case, I'm going to find the course that I'm in, and there's my rubric that we just made. I'll come down and I'll click use this rubric. When you click manage rubrics, I know some faculty might do this and go, oh, I need to remove some of these rubrics. When you click manage rubrics, it'll just take you to the rubric folder of the course you're in, and could cause some jostling. Like, oh wait, I thought I was trying to manage in Math 141, which I'm not sure why I have access to, but that's beside the point.
Right.
So I would go through, use this rubric, and then the rubric's just attached. Now, you'll notice that the point value here is different from the point value here. So if I am deciding that I want to grade using this rubric, which isn't a default setting, I would have to come back in and edit the rubric and go use this rubric for assignment grading. I could also do similar and remove points from the rubric, which would kind of negate that issue. And that's how you're thinking.
Not scoring
rubric. And then say I do want to use this rubric for grading. If I click update rubric, it's going to give me some, hey, you got some problems here, Nick. So first of all, I've got this total point difference. So I can make it so that Canvas changes it automatically, or whoops, I did the wrong one to do that, but let's do this again, use this. So update, oh, there we go, that's through. So what Canvas did was it went, oh, your rubric's got 35 points. We'll make the assignment 35 points. Okay. If you decide to not do that, when you're scoring with that rubric, you could potentially give them extra credit or something like that.
Okay. So you can intentionally make your rubric, maybe have an extra credit criteria that is worth more points. And as long as the point value of the rubric is higher than the point value of the assignment, that will turn into extra credit points.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So you just have to kind of keep that in mind. So you could accidentally give extra credit, or if you're trying to build that into the rubric, you can do it that way.
Okay.
And then there you go. We've got a rubric attached to the assignment. We've built it in a way where it's not easy to delete. We won't lose it. The next caveat that I'll kind of describe is that when we have multiple assignments with the same rubric, you can no longer edit that rubric. So since this assignment has this rubric and no others, because we just made it, have this rubric, I can go in and I can edit the wording and everything will be fine and dandy. If, for example, I look at another one of my rubrics, like this standard assignment rubric, I'll notice I can't actually edit it when I'm in my rubric folder.
because
And that
it's connected
means
to more than one.
it's connected to more than one. So if I did go into an assignment associated or having that rubric and try to edit, what it'll do is it'll create a copy of that rubric. So if I go into my assignments, and I think I used it for this one, my document annotation assignment, I try to edit it, this is what I'll get. You can't edit this rubric, either because you don't have permission, which is usually never the case for us as instructors.
And we can't see that from your
Oh,
screen share,
that always
but it's fine. He's got a dialog box that's telling him you can't do that.
Let me just do this. This will make it much easier. There we go. Okay.
Okay. Yep.
You can't edit this rubric either because you don't have permission or it's being used in more than one place. We have permission. It's because it's in another spot. So if I press OK, what it's going to do is it's going to ask me to retitle it because I'm making a copy. So actually, I won't retitle it and you'll see what it does automatically. But then I would go through and adjust. If I was just making it so that it uses the rubric for grading, it won't create the duplicate. But if I mess with anything up here, let's go a little crazy. What's going to happen is it'll make that copy. And so if I go back to my rubrics, I will now see, oh, there's a numeral at the end, and now I've got 2. So if you did this for every single one of your assignments, you could potentially have a ton of duplicate rubrics. Versioning could become an issue.
So let's say I have, a weekly discussion, and I have 15 discussions, and they're all using the same rubric, and I decide that I want to make a tweak to that rubric. What's the simplest, most straightforward workflow for dealing with that?
The simplest and most straightforward would be to go through and delete through your rubric folder whatever rubric you're using, and that would wipe it from every single assignment.
Okay.
And then you would have to manually
Make a new
jump into
rubric,
each.
which hopefully you have that rubric backed up in a document somewhere so that you don't have to recreate it from scratch. You just copy and paste it, make the changes. And then you have to reattach that rubric to each discussion.
Yep. And I don't like that being the simplest option, but it is the simplest option.
Because the other option is you'll end up with 15 different versions of the rubric floating around in your
course. I mean, if it is like a one-off, then yeah, I guess.
But in the long run, that becomes kind of an organizational nightmare. So.
And every time you make that copy, if you deleted it from the assignment, that specific assignment, it would remove it from the course, and then you'd be starting from scratch.
Yeah. And as Jennifer says, you still have to copy and paste in each individual cell of the rubric. You can't just upload the whole thing. It would be nice if you just upload a document with a table and it would parse that out into a rubric, but unfortunately it doesn't do that.
Yeah, so that is the drawback, is that versioning, trying to get a new one in and replacing old ones.
But all that being said, the reason this might all be worth this rigmarole is once you have the rubric designed in Canvas and attached to your assignments, it makes the grading process much easier because all you do is click through the criteria levels for one student's assignment using that rubric. It turns it into a score, and the students can see how they were scored on the rubric, which means
highly
feedback.
transparent.
I got this performance level on this criteria, and this is the description of why I got it. And this one, and it produces a ton of feedback without requiring a ton of writing on your part.
So hopefully the front end.
Yeah, as with many things in Canvas, you're front loading the work now to save yourself a lot of work later.
Which is of course easy to say.
Yeah.
Better, easier said than done. So with that, we've kind of gone through a workflow, talked about best practices. I'd like to open the floor for discussion, questions, comments, what resonates. And then
previous rubric nightmares that you had to deal with.
Maybe if you want to keep some people up at night, but if you do have to head out, please do. It's been a pleasure to have you. Otherwise, stick around. We'll kind of talk through any hanging items.
Yes. Dave says in the chat, what do people think of showing the rubric to students prior to grading? Personally, I think that's a really important part of transparency in your teaching practices. They should know what criteria they should be aiming to meet in order to get an A on the assignment. correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, by default, can they see the rubric before they submit an assignment, or is that a setting that you have to set?
I believe it's by default, but let's just take a look while we're here. So I'm going to jump into the student view. Let me find my student view. Am I in student view?
I don't see a student view button.
Yo, spaghettios. Let's try this.
There we go.
Okay, we found it. So let's take a look. Document annotation. I should be able to find my rubric. Oh, and this is an annotated document, so it might be showing up a little bit funky. But let's jump into a discussion. I think I've got a discussion somewhere that's going. While I'm finding that, I think I might have to make a new one with it.
What's that one there? Is that under annotation?
Yeah. So I just figured out something interesting about annotation assignments.
They don't have the rubric.
Oh, there it is.
Okay,
Okay,
so
that
that
was
one does
weird.
have one.
Oh, because I deleted it from the thing.
That's right. That's right.
Oh, there we go.
Hey, Olive.
Hey, Olive. Where in the world is? Okay, I've lost everything. Don't worry about me. No, don't drown on it. Okay, there we go. Hello.
So yeah, by default, the students, when they click on an assignment, they will see the rubric that is attached to that assignment right at the bottom of that page. And then
And in some instances, you might see, I think for like a discussion, you can't find the rubric unless you click the ellipses in the top right and then go show rubric. So for discussions,
you might want to tell students, if you're using them for discussions, you might want to tell them, make sure you look at the rubric before you post so you know how you're being graded.
and one thing I've done in the past is sometimes you can get away with copying and pasting this as a table into the bottom of your discussion board.
Sure,
Context
and it's always
box.
visible. That's
So-
a good idea.
But it's a little bit of a pain if there's versioning issues or revising. So
Yeah.
sometimes it takes a little bit of effort to kind of get that, but it pays off later on.
All right.
Oh yeah, and a screenshot would also work, right? Just making sure that you've got the alt text appropriate or have it written out somewhere.
Or if you built it in Word or Google Docs or something, I think you would be able to just copy the entire table. And I think it will preserve the table formatting
Yes.
when you paste it in.
Yes, actually, yes, that's correct. Because
So
it
that-
all
that
would
would-
be HTML stuff.
Yeah, so that might be the most accessible way to do that. Just copy the whole table, paste it into the assignment instructions for a discussion board, and then it should just be visible for students. So that's one way to do that. Anything else we want to talk about? Any questions or experiences that you'd love to share?
I'm just working through, so yeah. And thank you for the question, Dave. And then Jennifer said, yeah, for assignments, it is always visible. So thank you for that, Jennifer. And then Jennifer takes a screenshot of the rubric and posts it. Great, kind of addressed. All right. Oh yeah, losing a rubric is heartbreaking. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, well, if we don't have any other questions or comments, then we can probably call it a day for this Tech Talk. Hopefully this was helpful to you, either from the kind of design theory side or from the Canvas technical side, or maybe for both. Hopefully that was a helpful session for you.
Here's hoping.
Yeah, we don't have it. We don't have a Tech Talk scheduled for next week, do we? Because that's
Oh
the
yeah,
first
so
week of
that's May. So we gotta
so
get
we'll-
that sent out.
Yeah, we'll be sending out a newsletter soonish with our upcoming schedule for Tech Talks, and hopefully we will see you all at the next one.
Yeah, always great to have you.
Thanks, everybody.